A simple elderly woman is kicked out of first class until they find out she owns the airline. Margaret Sullivan clutched her worn leather handbag as she boarded Flight 2187 to San Francisco. At 78, her movements were deliberate but determined. Unlike the business travelers with expensive luggage, Margaret carried only a small, scuffed suitcase. "First class, seat 2A, she said, handing over her crumpled boarding pass. The flight attendant's smile flickered as she glanced between the pass and Margaret's modest appearance. Margaret settled into the plush leather seat as the cabin filled with executives and wealthy tourists. A tall man in a suit frowned as he took the seat beside her. As flight attendants offered champagne, Margaret overheard one whispering, "Must be an upgrade. She doesn't look like she belongs in first." The cabin director approached with a tablet. "Excuse me, ma'am. There seems to be a mix-up with your seating assignment. We'll need to relocate you to economy." "But my pass clearly shows seat 2A," Margaret replied calmly. "Sometimes the system makes mistakes," he said condescendingly. "I'm sure you'll be comfortable in economy." The businessman smirked. "I was wondering about the seating arrangement myself." Margaret felt heat rising to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but indignation. She had spent decades being underestimated. Usually, she let it pass. But not today. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," she said quietly. "Ma'am, I am the senior cabin crew member on this flight. I need you to comply with my request." Margaret reached for her phone. "Very well. But first, I need to make a quick call." Heavy clouds hung over Chicago O'Hare International Airport as Dale Jenkins rushed through the terminal. At 53, the executive vice president of customer experience for Summit Airlines moved with the urgency of someone perpetually late. His phone rang, and glancing at the screen, he froze mid-stride. The name Margaret Sullivan flashed across his display. "Margaret, is everything okay?" he answered, concern evident in his voice. "Dale, dear," came the familiar gentle voice. "I'm sorry to bother you at work." "Not at all. What's going on?" "Well, I'm sitting on Flight 2187 to San Francisco, and there seems to be some confusion about my seating assignment. The cabin director, Bradley, I believe, insists I need to move to economy. He says my first-class seat is reserved for a priority passenger." Dale closed his eyes, a sinking feeling in his stomach. "You're on our Chicago to San Francisco flight. Right now?" "Yes, dear. I was hoping to surprise you by coming to visit. It's been too long since I've seen you and the grandchildren." Dale pinched the bridge of his nose. "Margaret, please put Bradley on the phone." There was a shuffle, and then a confident male voice came on the line. "This is Senior Cabin Director Bradley Winters. How can I assist you?" "Bradley, this is Dale Jenkins, Executive Vice President of Customer Experience for Summit Airlines." There was a pause. "Oh, Mr. Jenkins, what can I do for you, sir?" "The woman you're trying to remove from first class. That's Margaret Sullivan." "Yes, sir. There appears to be a seating error and—" "There's no error, Bradley. Ms. Sullivan stays exactly where she is. In fact, make sure she has everything she needs for a comfortable flight." "But sir, we have a priority passenger who—" "Bradley," Dale cut him off, his voice dangerously quiet. "Margaret Sullivan isn't just any passenger. She's the majority shareholder of Summit Airlines. She owns the company." The silence that followed was deafening. "She— what?" "The woman you're trying to remove from first class owns the airline you work for. That simple, elderly woman founded Summit Airlines with her late husband 47 years ago. She may dress modestly and fly without announcement, but make no mistake, she signs the checks that pay your salary." Dale could practically hear Bradley's complexion paling through the phone. I had no idea, sir. The system didn't flag her as a VIP, and she doesn't— I mean, she seems so ordinary," Dale supplied. "Margaret has never believed in flaunting her success. Now, I suggest you return to her, apologize profusely, and ensure she has the best flight experience possible. And Bradley? We'll discuss this incident further when you land in San Francisco. Yes, sir. Right away, sir. The phone shuffled again, and Margaret's voice returned. Was that really necessary, Dale? Absolutely, it was, he replied firmly. Margaret, we've had this conversation before. You can't let people treat you this way. I've dealt with much worse in my life, dear. That doesn't make it right. Dale sighed. Why didn't you tell me you were coming? I wanted to surprise you. It's been 6 months since I've seen the grandchildren. They grow so fast at this age. Dale softened. They'll be thrilled to see you. Call me when you land. I'll pick you up myself. Bradley Winters had experienced many uncomfortable moments in his 15 years as a flight attendant, but nothing compared to the mortification he felt as he returned to seat 2A. The elderly woman, the owner of the entire airline, sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap as if nothing had happened. Ms. Sullivan, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to offer my sincerest apologies for the misunderstanding. Around them, first-class passengers looked up with interest. The businessman, who had been so dismissive, suddenly seemed very focused on his phone. There's no need for a scene, young man, Margaret replied softly. I'm perfectly comfortable where I am. Bradley swallowed hard. Of course. Can I bring you anything? Perhaps some champagne or a specialty cocktail? Just water, as I requested earlier. No ice. Right away. Miss Sullivan. He hesitated. I want you to know that your experience today doesn't reflect our standard of service at Summit Airlines. I take full personal responsibility for this error in judgment. Margaret studied him, seeing not arrogance now, but genuine remorse. We all make mistakes, Bradley. It's how we address them that matters. As Bradley hurried away, the businessman beside Margaret cleared his throat. Excuse me, but are you really Margaret Sullivan? The Margaret Sullivan. She turned to him with a slight smile. I'm just Margaret, dear. And you are? Richard Tanner, CEO of Vertex Capital. He extended his hand, his demeanor completely transformed. I had no idea I was sitting next to a legend in the aviation industry. Your story is remarkable, starting with one plane and building Summit into the third-largest carrier in the country. My husband Howard had the aviation expertise, Margaret replied. I just had a head for business and a belief that air travel should be accessible to everyone. Richard leaned in, lowering his voice. I've actually been hoping to schedule a meeting with your executive team. We have some investment opportunities that might interest Summit. How fortunate to run into you then, Margaret said with a twinkle in her eye. As they spoke, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin subtly shifted. Flight attendants appeared with attentive frequency. The captain himself emerged from the cockpit to personally welcome Margaret aboard. Passengers who had previously ignored her now watched with fascination. Bradley returned with her water. Ms. Sullivan, the captain has requested permission to make an announcement about having you on board today. Margaret shook her head firmly. That won't be necessary, Bradley. I prefer to travel without fanfare. Of course. He hesitated. Mr. Sullivan, may I ask, why didn't you identify yourself when I questioned your seating assignment? Margaret considered the question. In my experience, Bradley, how people treat you when they don't know your status reveals much more about their character than how they treat you when they do. Bradley's face flushed with shame. I've learned an important lesson today. Good, Margaret said simply. That's all any of us can hope for. Light rain misted the San Francisco International Airport as Flight 2187 touched down. Margaret had spent most of the flight in pleasant conversation with Richard Tanner, whose initial condescension had transformed into genuine respect. Bradley escorted her to the gate, where Dale was already waiting, distinguished in his executive uniform with the Summit Airlines insignia. There she is, he said, embracing her. How was the flight? Eventful, Margaret replied with a slight smile. Bradley stood awkwardly nearby. Mr. Jenkins, Ms. Sullivan received our highest level of service for the remainder of the flight. Dale raised an eyebrow. After the initial hiccup, you mean? Yes, sir. Again, I want to express my deepest apologies. Dale turned to Margaret. Was his service satisfactory after your call? Margaret studied Bradley's anxious expression. She had seen that look countless times throughout her career. People who had underestimated her, then feared for their livelihoods when they discovered their mistake. Howard had always been quicker to fire than she was. Margaret believed in second chances. Bradley was exemplary, she said. Once the confusion was cleared up, relief washed over the cabin director's face. Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. Dale didn't look entirely convinced, but nodded. We still need to discuss updating our VIP protocols. My office, tomorrow, 9 a.m. Yes, sir, Bradley replied, before turning to Margaret. It was an honor to serve you, Mrs. Sullivan. I hope you'll fly with us again soon. I suspect I will, Margaret said with a twinkle in her eye. After all, I do have a vested interest in the company's success. Emma's shriek of delight echoed through the Jenkins San Francisco home as Margaret stepped through the front door. At 12 years old, Emma was at that precious age where she was beginning to grow up, but still retained the uninhibited joy of childhood. "Grandma!" she cried, launching herself into Margaret's arms. "Nobody told me you were coming." "That's what makes it a surprise, sweetheart," Margaret laughed, hugging her granddaughter tightly. Sarah, Dale's wife and Margaret's daughter, emerged from the kitchen. At 49, she was the spitting image of Margaret in her younger years. The same determined eyes, the same graceful posture that conveyed strength without aggression. "Mom!" Sarah exclaimed, embracing Margaret. "Why didn't you tell us you were coming?" "And miss the look on your face right now." Margaret smiled. "Never." 9-year-old James appeared at the top of the stairs, his face breaking into a gap-toothed grin when he spotted his grandmother. "Grandma Maggie!" he shouted, taking the stairs 2 at a time despite his mother's warnings to slow down. Later, as Sarah prepared dinner, Margaret sat at the kitchen island, sipping tea and watching her daughter move efficiently around the space. "Dad told me about what happened on the flight," Sarah said. "You should have called me instead. I would have had that flight attendant transferred to our Arctic Circle route." Margaret chuckled. "You and Dale are so much alike, always ready to go to battle. For you, absolutely." Sarah turned, her expression serious. "Mom, you can't keep letting people treat you that way. You're Margaret Sullivan. You built an empire from nothing." "I'm well aware of who I am, dear," Margaret replied calmly. "But what happened today was hardly unusual. I've experienced similar treatment my entire career, which is exactly why it needs to stop." Sarah put down her knife. "Mom, you're the majority shareholder of a multi-billion-dollar company. You've earned every accolade, broken every glass ceiling. Why do you still let people diminish you?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I suppose I've never felt the need to announce myself. My work speaks for itself. But when it doesn't, when people see only an elderly woman in simple clothes, you suffer for it. And worse, you allow it." Before Margaret could respond, Emma burst into the kitchen. "Grandma, I found your old Summit Airlines commercial on YouTube. The one from the 1980s where you and Grandpa are standing in front of the First Fleet. Can we watch it?" As the family gathered in the living room to watch the vintage commercial, Margaret felt a wave of nostalgia wash over her. There she was, 40 years younger, standing proudly beside Howard as they introduced their growing airline to America. "Summit Airlines," Howard's voice boomed from the screen, "where the sky is just the beginning." The camera had then panned to Margaret, who delivered the tagline they'd spent weeks perfecting. "At Summit, every passenger matters. Every journey counts. Every passenger matters." The words echoed in Margaret's mind as she watched her younger self. Had Summit Airlines, had she, strayed from that founding principle? The Summit Airlines executive boardroom fell silent as Margaret Sullivan entered, followed by Dale, It was 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before Bradley Winters was scheduled to arrive for his meeting. Around the polished mahogany table sat the company's senior leadership team, hastily assembled at Dale's request. "Margaret," said CEO Thomas Reynolds, rising to greet her. "This is an unexpected pleasure. We weren't aware you were in San Francisco." "Clearly," Margaret replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Otherwise, perhaps your cabin crew would have recognized the woman who signs their paychecks." Thomas cleared his throat. "Dale briefed me on yesterday's unfortunate incident. I assure you, we take this matter very seriously." "As do I," Margaret said, taking a seat at the head of the table, a position she rarely occupied since stepping back from day-to-day operation. "Which is why I'm here this morning." Dale distributed folders to each executive. Inside, you'll find Margaret's proposal for a company-wide initiative to return to our core values, particularly regarding customer experience. Margaret watched as the executives opened the folders. Summit Airlines was founded on the principle that every passenger deserves respect and dignity, regardless of appearance, background, or status. Yesterday's incident suggests we've drifted from that foundation. "One employee's mistake hardly reflects our entire company culture," objected Vanessa Chen, the chief marketing officer. "Doesn't it?" Margaret countered. "I've spent the night reviewing our customer complaint data for the past 5 years. Incidents of discourtesy have increased by 27%. Customer satisfaction scores in economy class have declined steadily. Meanwhile, our first-class experience has become increasingly exclusive and exclusionary. The P20, back to basics, initiative outlined in your folders represents a return to our founding principles," Dale explained. "Every executive will be required to fly economy at least once per quarter. Customer service training will be overhauled. And most importantly, we're instituting a respect at every level policy." A knock at the door interrupted the discussion. Bradley Winters entered, freezing momentarily when he saw not just Dale, but Margaret and the entire executive team waiting. "Mr. Winters," Dale said formally, "please join us." Bradley took the only empty seat, directly across from Margaret. To his credit, he maintained his composure, despite the obvious tension in the room. "I was expecting a disciplinary meeting," he said honestly. "This is something more important," Margaret replied. "Mr. Winters, would you please share with the leadership team what happened on Flight 2187 yesterday and why you initially asked me to leave first class?" Bradley swallowed hard, but met her gaze. "I made a judgment based on appearance. Mrs. Sullivan was dressed simply, appeared elderly and somewhat frail, and didn't fit my mental image of our typical first-class passenger. I assumed there had been a mistake in the system, rather than considering that she had every right to be there. And had I been a young man in an expensive suit," Margaret prompted, "I would never have questioned your seating assignment," Bradley admitted. Margaret nodded, turning to the executive. "This is the problem we need to address. Not just for me, I'm quite capable of defending myself, but for every passenger who faces similar assumptions and doesn't have the owner's number on speed dial." Thomas leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Margaret?" "A complete cultural reset," she replied firmly. "Summit Airlines will lead the industry in equitable treatment across all service levels. Mr. Winters here will help design and implement the new training program." Bradley looked up in shock. "Me? Who better?" Margaret asked. "You've experienced firsthand how unconscious bias affects customer interactions. Consider this your opportunity to transform a mistake into meaningful change." As the meeting concluded, Bradley approached Margaret cautiously. "Ms. Sullivan, I don't know what to say. I expected to be terminated, not promoted to lead a company-wide initiative." Margaret studied him thoughtfully. "Mr. Winters, in my 50 years in business, I've learned that our worst moments often contain our greatest opportunities for growth. Yesterday, you judged me based on appearances and were profoundly mistaken. The question now is, what will you do with that lesson?" Bradley straightened his shoulders. "I'll make it count, Miss Sullivan. I promise you that." "Good," Margaret replied with a genuine smile. "Because at Summit Airlines, every passenger matters. Every journey counts." 6 months later, Margaret sat in seat 2A on a flight to Chicago. She wore the same cardigan, but something was different. Perhaps the way others responded to her. "Ms. Sullivan, welcome aboard," said the flight attendant, recognizing her immediately. Margaret observed the cabin crew interacting with passengers, more attentive and genuinely engaged with travelers of all types. Bradley had exceeded expectations in his new role, channeling his embarrassment into improving service across the airline. The businessman beside her offered his hand. "Mrs. Sullivan, what an honor! I read about you in Business Week. Your story is truly inspiring." "Thank you," Margaret replied, thinking of the media attention she had reluctantly embraced after Sarah convinced her that visibility could drive change. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the captain announced her presence. Once, this would have mortified her. Today, she simply smiled at the applause that followed. Life was too short to diminish yourself for others. Comfort. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman who had spent decades being underestimated could do was stand in her truth and let the world adjust. As the aircraft accelerated, Margaret thought about her journey, not just the physical one, but the longer journey of building something meaningful. Every passenger matters. Every journey counts, including hers.